everyone, I'm Cyril Filias, the Program's Learning and Development Specialist at CEREC. Welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of all the CEREC team, thank you to the so many of you with us today. We are pleased to see once again the community coming together with more than 2,000 people who have registered for this webinar. So thank you all. And today we are delighted to have Lorraine, Godden and Carolyn Hoessler with us, who will talk about remote learning, experiential learning, and present their outcome-based experiential learning framework. But before our presenter gets started, I would like to take a few moments to introduce you to CEREC, for those of you who don't know us yet, and share some housekeeping notes with you. So CEREC is a charitable organization that focuses on education and research in career counseling and career development in Canada. We have three main programs: the careerwise.ca website, which features the top news and view in the field with a French version called orientation.ca, the Canadian Journal of Career Development, which is free to access, and the Connexus National Career Development Conference held in Ottawa each January, and for which we recently launched a call for presenter for Connexus 21. So you can learn more about all the CEREC work and resources at cerec.ca. And finally, and as always, thank you in advance for taking the time to answer our short survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the webinar, and to share your feedback and future learning needs with us. So thank you in advance for your answer. Now, some quick housekeeping notes. If during today's webinar you have any questions or any comments, please enter them in the question box you see on your screen. We will have a Q&A session where Lorraine and Carolyn will address all your questions at the end of the webinar. Also, please note that we will send you the recording of today's webinar along with a presentation slide later today. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our first presenter, Lorraine. Lorraine Godden is an instructor at Carleton University, where she teaches career development, employability, and career management skill courses in the Faculty of Public Affairs. Lorraine specializes in understanding how career and life planning, work integrated learning, and other educational multidisciplinary policy are interpreted and enacted into educational programming and public policy intervention. Lorraine has 20+ years of experience implementing, evaluating, and researching work-related policy in compulsory and post-secondary education. We are thrilled to have Lorraine with us for this webinar, and she's not coming alone, so I'm happy to introduce you to our second presenter, Carolyn. Carolyn Hoessler is an educational developer and the founder of Higher Education and Beyond. She has over 14 years of consulting and works with team redesigning learning in higher education and professional development, both locally and nationally. Carolyn specializes in designing relevant experiences, assessment and evaluation, and entangling key influencing factors to inform clear paths forward. We are so pleased to have them, to have these two experts with us today. So let's not wait any longer to have them start their presentation. So over to you, Carolyn.
Thank you very much, Cyril, for the introductions, and welcome everyone today. And I wanted to begin by acknowledging the traditional and continued territory of the First People and First Nations that we're on today. So my name is Carolyn Hoessler. I'm coming to you today from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and I am on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. Lorraine? Oh, Lorraine, you're muted.
Yeah. Welcome to you all. It's really good to be here to spend this time with you today and to share our framework with you. And I speak to you from, I live near Ottawa, and we're on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. So the title of our webinar that we're going to discuss with you today is how do we go remote with experiential learning and work integrated learning, particularly when we're in a remote location, and we want to discuss with you our practical approach to outcome-based experiential learning. We are all here, right, because right now we are in the heart of an unprecedented challenge of trying to provide experiential learning and work integrated learning in the midst of this pandemic. We are going to talk to you about how we have developed an outcome-based framework, the OBEL framework, that we believe is helpful in directing us into how best to respond to this challenge of continuing to provide experiential learning and work integrated learning remotely. We are also going to outline the multiple outcomes, key stakeholders, and 5 crucial design factors and activity and assessment options that we need to navigate to appropriately support our students within this remote environment. And this next slide just encapsulates what we hope to cover with you today. And you will see that we are going to cover our stakeholders, and we're going to talk about our intended outcomes of experiential learning. And we're going to try to make this session interactive for you so that you have time to think about your role and outcomes and who your key stakeholders are. And we're going to present to you 5 design factors that can be used to help you and support you as we work within this pandemic, and how you align those to your activities and assessment options for your students. So a little bit about where we started with this work. Well, we commenced this work with a landscape scan of publicly funded universities in 2 provinces in Canada. And we looked at university websites, we downloaded everything we could find about experiential learning and work integrated learning outcomes, and then we analysed what we found. The reason that we looked at outcomes was that we were very interested in what universities were saying about what they were doing with experiential learning and work integrated learning, and then what they were actually doing for EL and WIL. Our work has been underpinned by the scholarly literature, and this has directed us to be looking for the stakeholders involved, the design factors, and any options for EL and WIL that were described, as was highlighted on the previous slide. Our work has also been framed by our own experiences. Both of us have been delivering, managing, and evaluating EL and WIL for many years. But also it's important for you to understand that we've been receiving feedback as well along the way in this process as we have developed this OBEL framework. So we begin with the stakeholders. And you can see from this slide that there's a number of things I'm going to direct you to look at as I talk to you about stakeholders. I think we're all aware that there are many different stakeholders within the EL and WIL environment. And through our work, we found there to be 2 key sets of stakeholders, both of which are important as we go through and try to work with EL and WIL in our remote environment. And these are represented on your screens through this visual from our OBEL framework. At the center of this visual, you will see that experience is right there. That's deliberately placed centrally because that allows us to see how all of the stakeholders connect to the experience. Surrounding the experience, there are 3 EL and WIL experience partners. These are the folks directly connected to experiential learning and work integrated learning, and they comprise of the learner or our students, the educators that are involved, and the contact person or workplace supervisor who is in the placement. So these are the people that are immediately connected to that experience. And of course, they're very important because of that. But we'll see that there are a number of stakeholders that also surround those as well. We have termed these to be the broader stakeholders. And these broader stakeholders, well, there are some for each of those 3 people we've already mentioned, the learner, educators, and contact person. But then there are also some stakeholders within the broader community, any relevant disciplinary and professional associations, and various and multiple levels of government. What is important is that when you're planning EL and WIL, that you know who these folks are, what their roles are within your experiential learning and work integrated learning planning, pedagogy, and practices, and how you can effectively work with them in your remote environments. Well, to unpack this some more, I'm going to pass you over now to Carolyn, and she's going to take us through our OBEL framework outcomes. These are the outcomes that all of these stakeholders will often have, and yet they're not always explicit to us as we go through this planning process.
Thank you, Lorraine. As Lorraine just mentioned, each of these stakeholders will enter in with the outcomes that they have in mind. And what we wanted to do is try to make some of these outcomes explicit and clear and something we can be talking about. This page has a lot on it, and the reason is I'm hoping that if you have one of those computers that screenshot it, you can grab it this way, or you'll be able to see it in the slides that you have later. We list here 47 distinct outcomes. So when someone says to me, I want to come and I want to bring my students and I want them to have a great work experience, and I go, great. I now know there are 47 different ways they can have an amazing work experience, 47 different outcomes that they can have. So this slide helps us to try to make explicit what we're aiming for and what others are aiming for. I'm going to orient you to the slide, and then I'm going to talk about the different pieces in here. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the fact that what you'll see here is kind of two columns. Imagine it's a really long table that we've just kind of sliced and put in two. In that table, you have a series of categories, and the categories are on the left, and then we have the outcomes on the right for each of these parts of the table. The categories are things like career readiness, technical skills, being able to adapt to changing environments through conceptual expertise, interpersonal qualities, growth and integration, basic literacies, and then a series of relational outcomes, the student and community, the institution, the student, the institution and potential students, faculty and community, institutions and community, organizations and students, and then tangible outcomes that benefit either the organization or society. So giving you a sense that there's this many potential outcomes for any experiential learning or work integrated learning experience. So part of this project started because we thought, all right, let's talk about some of the outcomes and what it might be important. We didn't quite at the time anticipate 47 distinct ones, but as we reflected on our experience and we brought this so far to others at different conferences and different conversations, including most recently at Connexus, we're able to hear from people that yes, these indeed are the outcomes that they are seeing in their practice and seeing in their experiences. So the outcomes that we're talking about include things in the career readiness, such as having an experience and awareness of workplace context and norms. But there also might be the career readiness goal of professional networks or exploring career options. So even when we say career readiness, there may be some different outcomes within that. Within technical skills, it might be increasing the memory retention of those technical skills or the ability to take this kind of training or theory and apply it into practice. Through this idea of adaptability through conceptual expertise, it's this idea that they can potentially integrate theory and practice. They can understand when, why, and how to do things, not just always do the same approach every time. They also may have shifts in their beliefs and values. So one example of that is we often say we want students to come and see a different culture or a different experience or a different context and have them learn that the world isn't always the same way they are. And in our case, when we have that, I can actually say to somebody, okay, so one of your goals is that you're going to shift their values and their beliefs, their worldviews. That's going to be very different than a technical skill. So how do we embed those in? And we'll be talking options in this webinar as well. So tangible, yeah, I could do that. So we'll be getting to those, but the first step we want to talk about is what our outcomes are, because our outcomes are going to ground our process. So interpersonal qualities, those are the things that the Conference Board of Canada highlights as communication, leadership, collaboration, and cultural competence. In growth and integration, we're talking that ability to lifelong learn, that ability to plan, oh, I want to know more about this, therefore I'm going to contact this person, therefore I'm going to develop these skills. That kind of planning that often gets talked about in a career center. Thinking about your journey that you're going to be doing. The basic literacies, and then the relational outcomes with the different individuals benefiting. One of the things we heard across the different institutions is that students often engage in experiential learning according to the universities because they want to make a difference. So that's that student community. but we also heard that they wanted, institutions want to do it because of increasing student engagement, student retention, or attracting those potential high quality potential students. There's also this idea that other members of this group can benefit. So the institution and community can have a relationship with alumni or funding or collaborations. Also the organization students can kind of have this idea of learning about each other, and that the employer can be a benevolent employer, creating an opportunity for the student that may not have existed, as well as they can attract new employees and board members. Tangible outputs include things like an organization benefiting on a project they may have lacked resources to do, or they get a different perspective on. And in terms of tangible outputs for the community, there's the idea of turning innovative ideas into real solutions. When somebody from the community brings a problem to students perhaps, or newcomers, and then they ask them to create a good real solution. And so that idea that there's a lot of potential benefits. So again, I've outlined, we said there was 47, I've outlined some categories here. So that's career readiness, technical skills, adaptability through conceptual expertise, interpersonal qualities, growth and integration, basic literacies, and relational outcomes and tangible outcomes. What I would like you to do now is a bit of reflection. So there's a poll, and you're going to get access to this poll, and this is a poll through Google Forms. And what we're going to try is to make sure the system works to do that. So if there's any issues, please put them in the chat, and Sorrel is monitoring that conversation and will let us know if there's any issues. But the web address that will be posted in the chat is the link. And when you see that link come in, you will actually be able to just click on it. So the link's gone into the chat, you should be able to see that and click on it. Or you can type into the URL address bar bit.ly, and it's capital O, capital B, capital E, capital L, May, no space. So please be going to that poll, and I'll just shift my screen and we can see the results coming in. So what you will see when you get to the poll is what you see on the left side of my screen, which is a series of questions. You'll be asked about the role in the opportunity. So think of one experiential learning or work integrated learning opportunity you're involved in or planning. What is your role is the first question. Who are your stakeholders are the second question. What are the outcomes that matter for this project is the third question. So it's just 3 questions. I've kept the outcomes on the screen, but you should be able to see both of these pieces. So one of the things I can do is I can start seeing the responses as they come in. And you'll see this number continuing to rise as we go, but you can see who the people are in this room. So we are seeing the numbers coming in, and you'll just kind of see this adjusting as it goes. So one of the things that we'll notice just off the top is that every single category of outcomes is included. So when we do experiential learning or work integrated learning, we are looking at those very distinct learning outcomes. One of the things we are saying in this webinar is both experiential learning and work integrated learning, there is a distinction between them in terms of the priority of those outcomes, and also in terms of kind of one of the design factors that we'll be talking about, which is the context that it typically occurs in. But from our perspective today, we'll be talking a bit about both, but happy to continue the conversation if you want a clearer distinction between them later on. So as we're seeing, we're getting about 361 responses. What you'll notice here is that things start to kind of collapse up, but we can see that there are key stakeholders include community partners and very much the learner. Then there's kind of a mix of everybody else as well. And I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller so we can kind of keep seeing it. So you can see here all the different groups that are coming in. Disciplinary professional associations are in there. Institutional leadership is in there. Career center staff, educators as well. But we're definitely seeing the learner, and we're definitely seeing the community partner as key parts in here. In addition to that, we're also seeing the roles of the individuals who are in this webinar. A lot of them are employment center or career center staff. We're seeing individuals who are faculty or institutional program leadership, and we're seeing educators. So that's who's in the room but look at also who you're engaging with. In terms of the outcomes below, this will kind of keep popping up and down. We have career readiness is in the front runner as to the outcome that seems to be the top one. And then we also have, if I grab this slide, it will hopefully stop bouncing. There we go. So career readiness is there. We also see every single one of these outcomes are being represented. So one of the things to note is that when you are engaging in these conversations, you're seeing additional ones. We're also seeing meaningful employment and outcomes for individual experiences in addition. So when you're looking at this breakdown of the responses, one of the things to think about is just who you're having a conversation with and how many people that you're going to be talking about it in different ways. So the roles may vary, our stakeholders may vary, but also in addition to that, our outcomes vary. So this is the first check that we often say is who's involved, who are stakeholders, and what are the outcomes. So I'm going to say, please keep sending those in. Lorraine and I get a chance to look through the details of this afterwards, but thank you very much for participating so far. And we're gonna go and look at those design factors next. So thank you very much for completing the poll. And as you see here, just a quick note that interpersonal growth and integration and relational as well as the career readiness are the top ones that came in as for outcomes. All right. So Lorraine, would you like to speak to the 5 design factors?
I certainly would, thank you. And that's the next step in this process, is that once we've thought about what outcomes we want to achieve, we need to think about how we're going to design some experiences in order to try to achieve those outcomes. And so with our framework, we're drawing on decades of educational and learning theory to identify what likely influences there might be on this process, but also on what we have considered is really important, a constructive alignment within this process to inform and produce aligned experiential education. And we're going to come and talk about that alignment a little bit further on in our webinar and why we're arguing that that's really important. But for now, let's concentrate on these design factors because they are of crucial importance too. And we've identified 5 as being particularly relevant as you plan to undertake experiential learning and work integrated learning. And the first one of these that we need to consider is the social and physical context. And typically this means you need to think about what learning you want to take place in the classroom, the workplace, and or your community. And we also need to think about the level of social learning and responsibility. So now we begin to consider, once we've decided where the learning is taking place and what learning is happening in those various locations, how immersed is the student in this process? Is this a phased process that the student is going to go through? And typically it would be, with them beginning with some kind of observational role and then gradually becoming more immersed in the experience as their skills develop and expand and they become more confident and their efficacy develops and all of those things that we expect as they go through a learning process. Then, in order to achieve that, we usually expect some kind of scaffolding to take place. So what do we mean by scaffolding? Well, this would be typically the pieces of learning that are deliberately structured in order to support the student's development. So, and this happens within a zone of proximal development. So these are the people who is involved within this zone, how close are they to the student, and where is the student situated within that. So for example, we need to think about what scaffolding does a student require within this particular experiential learning experience they want to have. Who's responsible for this? What are the roles of faculty, student, supervisor, or named person within this process? And then what expertise is needed by each of them in order to be adequate at scaffolding for that student through that experience? So then we move on to sequence and timing. This is another thing we need to think about within our design factors. Are we commencing with theory, which is then followed by practice and then application? Or do we want students to have the experience first? Do we want them to be immersed in the experience prior to learning the theory in order that they can then unpack and contextualize that theory? Or do we wish students to enter into this and have an iterative experience where they move between theory and experience in a more cyclical manner? So they have some kind of experience, then they learn some theory, then they go back and have more of an experience, then they build more on that theory, and so on. And then finally, we need to think about length of time and intensity of experiential learning and work integrated learning. Now, this obviously is determined by many factors, and we know that for some pieces of experiential learning, they might be relatively short. They may be short, immersive experiential pieces that are embedded within a class, within a lesson. So you may be getting a group of students to work together for 20 minutes on a case study, for example, where they work, and it's a sort of an experiential learning piece that's built into that lesson. But it also may be much longer. It might be a 3-month internship, for example. So this is important to know because we can plan the intensity of what that experience is that's determined by those time factors. And some of those will be flexible and some will be inflexible. But they also are really important in determining what outcomes we can achieve within this planned time frame. So when we look at these 5 design factors, I think you can see that every one of those impacts upon the others. And it's very, very difficult to look at those in isolation. They are all important and they are all influential in this process. And they will all have a big influence on whether you can actually achieve your intended outcomes for your students through their experiential learning or work integrated learning. But, and here is the but, and this is why we're here today. What about when we are going remote? I hear you cry. And this is a big piece because you can see, as I've spoken about this, a lot of this relies on students being able to be in a placement or being able to be in a face-to-face environment. And we're operating in a very different environment now remotely. So I'm going to pass you back to Carolyn, and she's now going to take us through what these 5 design factors now look like for us in our remote environment.
So thinking about what it means to be in a pandemic. So all of us have experienced that experience of this isn't normal. It kind of looks normal, but it isn't normal. And what's going on here? So what Lorraine and I did is take these 5 design factors and think about what has shifted in a pandemic. By doing so, what we have discovered is this is why experiential learning is feeling so hard and so challenging in this moment. So in a pandemic, every one of these factors is highly constrained. Most of the time when something happens, we're constraining one of these. Maybe it is how long we can do it. Our length is constrained by a class schedule. Maybe our sequence is constrained by when a guest speaker is available. But in this case, every one of these factors is being constrained. And this helps us put into perspective what is going on in this pandemic for experiential learning and work integrated learning. So from the social and physical context, the first thing we notice is, well, the physical context now looks very different. The physical context is now people's homes. So a student might have one room in our apartment or one room in which they're going to be doing this rather than an entire workplace, rather than an entire hospital, or rather than an entire community that they might have engaged in. Their workplace physically, or their experiential place physically, becomes those 4 walls. In addition to that, there's a modified social context. It's not an inauthentic social context because it is what their colleagues and workplace context are also experiencing in a lot of ways, but it's a modified social context because how we're interacting with each other in this pandemic isn't necessarily how we typically interact with each other. So it's a modified social context they're experiencing. From a social learning and responsibility, we've actually taken out the really good part in the middle. So we have essentially left us with a virtual observer that's on site or a virtual participant that is a little hard to interact unless you really build those interactions into meetings. So we have this almost observer role that's preserved. We also have an independent practice role observed. So those who are already experienced, perhaps a more senior level student, they're able to kind of say, continue on doing what they're doing and do it a bit independently. But what we've really missed is that kind of middle ground of social learning where, okay, I can watch you do it, then I can kind of do it myself with your observation, and then maybe I'm going to do it a little bit more with your observation while you're there, and then I'm going to have some guided questions potentially, and then I'm going to eventually build up to that more independent practice. So we're having a challenge because that's where often work integrated learning is in that middle part. It's that it's not an observer and it's not independent practice, but it's that scaffolded kind of middle part of participation. It's that slowly gaining more and more responsibility. So how do we structure our opportunities knowing that that middle is not there? That might change the level of task we provide to people because they do have to be more independent earlier on in their practicums and earlier on in their workplace experiences. From a zone of proximal development, this is where we often scaffold and mentor and have peers share ideas, but we have very limited staff time in a lot of cases. We also have not enough time to scaffold, and maybe even awkward to scaffold because I'm trying to show you how to do something on a screen like this. And if I'm showing you how to code something into Excel or do an analysis, that's fine. I can screen share and then you screen share back and repeat back. But if I'm trying to show you a physical task, we're kind of limited. I can't just pick it up and show you. I can show you here, but I can't, it's not 3D. So we're limited time, we're limited opportunity to show, we have limited contact with peers and mentors, and we're not necessarily sitting next to each other working on tasks, go, hey, by the way, do you remember what they said in the meeting about what to do in this unusual case? Because I think I just encountered it. You can't just say that to a colleague unless you've developed the Slack spaces or the chat spaces or the email protocol about what to do when those questions arise. So thinking about that. In the theory and application sequence, what has happened in a pandemic is that we basically have no sequence. Sequence requires us to plan ahead what's going to happen when. And a lot of this has been highly disrupted and it's not predictable. We used to be able to say by week 10, everybody's going to have some experiences. So we can talk about theory in week 10 or vice versa. We can talk about theory and then week 10 is when everyone's going to experience it and then they can do their assignment in week 11. But we no longer can plan that. Week 10 is not going to be week 10. So thinking about how we can address this is we actually have to limit to the idea we're going to provide theory first that may be asynchronous or it may be synchronous, but then we're going to have a window of applying it afterwards. That window is going to have to flex because what we see next in the time and intensity is that the lengths are either shortened or flexibly extended to accommodate life happening. So we have them shorter because maybe then they'll actually get through everything in that short period of time. Maybe it's more manageable. But we also have to recognize that a lot of students aren't going to be able to complete it in that time because of what may be happening in their lives. It is not, it's not a normal context for people. It's good to plan life happening anyways, but there's more life happening to more people now. So the length and intensity can also change without notice. So not only is it that the length and intensity is being extended or shortened, but it actually can be extended or shortened halfway through our experiences. So this is why when you're saying, well, it's a co-op, I've done co-op 15 times, I've supervised 15 times, we've ran this program 15 times, but this feels really different or there's stuff going on. This is the slide that says, yep, there is stuff going on, and it is not, it's not the design parameters we normally have. We have very constrained design parameters. So this is hoping, like, putting it more explicit why there's these challenges. So the next thing we wanted to do is say, well, given these design parameters, what does this mean for options? So practical, tangible options. So Lorraine?
Thank you, Carolyn. And so once again, there's quite a lot of content on this screen in front of you, but hopefully I'll talk you through this and it will make sense to you as I do so. As you look at your screen, you will see we've organised the activities undertaken typically in experiential learning or work integrated learning to highlight how we need to align those to our intended outcomes, but then also we need to think about assessment. And I know this is the first time we've mentioned assessment, but this is crucial too, because that's our way of measuring whether we've achieved our outcomes. You'll see at the top of the slide that we once again included the design factors, because we do need to be reminded of them as we select which activity to offer our students and what outcome is actually feasible from the activity and how we're going to assess that completion. And so I'm just going to sort of spend some time just highlighting what this might look like as we select one of these outcomes and the activity that is related to the outcome. So we'll begin with student career readiness. And our poll showed that an awful lot of you are very interested in preparing your students for future careers. So this is a big piece that's very meaningful to experiential learning and work integrated learning. So what activities can we undertake in this remote environment? Well, one of the things we could ask our students to do is undertake some informational or expert interviews. And these could be undertaken over the phone or through a virtual meeting or both. And then to assess that experience for them, we could then ask them to identify the key skills that that person had developed in order to undertake that job and pursue that career. And then they can relate those skills back to their own skill development. And we can assess that where they are within that skill development and where they want to go. And this would then also help to feed into their career planning. And what other activities they might seek to pursue through their experiential learning. It could be that our chosen outcome is to develop students' technical skills. And so how would we go about that in our remote environment? Well, one of the things we might ask them to do is to write a manual or update a manual. And so they would be working on their technical skills as they pursued that activity. And then they could have touch-in meetings with whoever the person is who they're preparing that manual for, and use their technical skills through those touch-in meetings and reporting. And that could be assessed through a daily check-in or a weekly check-in where they have to give feedback on their progress, and they would have to use various technical communication methods within our remote environment to be able to do that. We might be looking as our outcome to develop students' adaptability through their conceptual expertise. And this is where it suddenly becomes quite challenging, because typically the conceptual expertise would be developed through the institution where they're undertaking their program of learning. And now all of a sudden we've removed into a remote learning environment. So there's the challenge on faculty to be developing to that conceptual expertise within this environment as well. Well, we can do a number of strategies, but we've highlighted a couple that we think students would find valuable experiences. For example, if we're thinking about graduate students, we could ask them to become involved in writing grant proposals. And this is something that could be achieved easily through a remote environment. And then they would go through a review process that the faculty could set up. And this would also be useful for undergrad students who want to pursue graduate study later on, for example, or any student that wants to go into a workplace where some kind of reporting is going to be really important and be an important skill for them to develop. What about thinking about developing students' interpersonal qualities? Well, there's a number of strategies, once again, that we could use, a number of options available for us to plan with activities. One of these could be to participate in regular team meetings. And we're all having to do a lot more Zoom and virtual meetings right now, more than we've ever had to. And so this is an activity that's very relevant for students to develop their communication skills within this environment, and also feeds into their technical skill development. So many of these activities could be used to achieve more than one outcome for the students. And once again, we would ask them to self-assess, or we could have some kind of assessment strategy that's created for that particular outcome and activity. And then if we were thinking about developing students' growth and integration, one of the activities we could do is ask students to read a key biography about somebody else's growth and development. They could then relate that growth to their own. It could be a deeply reflective experience, which is what we try hard to achieve with experiential learning and work integrated learning, because we know how important that self-reflection is. And that once again could be through a scaffolded process, a guided process that's led by their key person, their key supervisor person with their placement, and their faculty member or whoever they're working with who supports this experience. And then the final outcome we've highlighted is relational outcomes. And this can be really difficult to try to achieve when we're in a remote environment. If we want to develop students' social and emotional learning skills, for example, how do we do this when we're detached from people and when human interaction is limited to a remote environment? One activity we could ask students to do is engage in mentoring. They could engage in a mentoring program with high school students, for example, and see what mentoring is like as it operates within a remote environment. And once again, this could also feed into the achievement of a range of other outcomes. So this could be a strategy that would be useful for developing many different key skills for students and helping them to achieve their outcomes. And once again, a deeply reflective process on the mentoring experience. So after just having a kind of whirlwind tour of those options, we now want to take a little pause and get you to think about these. And you're going to see another poll appear on your screen. And we would like you to spend a few moments thinking about what of these options might be useful to you. What activities might you be considering? Have you already used, or any new ones that are of interest to you? So in the poll, and I think we're going to do this as a Google Doc, and we'd like you to enter either a word or a short phrase that represents your option selection.
And if you have any challenge accessing the Google Doc, please just put your information in the chat, and Sorrel is going to copy that into the Google Doc for you. So if you do have trouble getting into the Google Doc, given our numbers, that would be an alternative there. So one of the things I'm going to also do is just switch my screen, so we'll be able to see that Google Doc as well. And we'll start to see in here. So in this Google Doc, what we want to do is just start typing these in. So I'm going to just note that we just have an open space here. It may be helpful actually to just kind of grab our headers. I'm just thinking given the numbers, and I have trying to reconnect on my end, but you'll see a lot of people have started to join in. If you can join into the Google Doc and enter in your ideas that you're going to be trying, and if there's particular outcomes that are relevant to you, just put those outcomes behind your answer. If you're having trouble going into this Google Doc because there is quite a few people trying to enter it, please just post your information in the chat. So take a moment, write it down, think about it. And we are having several hundred people try to go into Google Doc. So just a recognition that there may be a limitation to this technology. So giving you the option of the chat box as well. As people are entering that in, I think I'm going to just answer a couple of key kind of questions that came up during the session. So one of the questions is, what happens if community partners no longer have capacity to engage with us? One of the things that you could do, depending on how much capacity it is, if the door is firmly closed, say, I really wish you all the best. If a question comes up is maybe saying, we have a series of students who are willing to create some information graphics or summaries for you. Is there a key question like an FAQ you keep having that you would like to have a summary of good practice on, or an up-to-date summary about, or an FAQ about, or an infographic about? Asking people to provide that information, that might be an option. If a group is unable to do a virtual field trip because they don't have the technical expertise at the time, but they have old footage that you could kind of piece together something. Maybe there's an option there. So thinking about what kind of expertise you can have, and then you can find a student who maybe needs that task time. So maybe that student's part of their experiential learning is to call up and offer their services of creating summaries. So that doesn't have to be something that comes to the staff to do, but it could be a one-of strategy is to offer to community groups those opportunities to provide, say, infographics or information packages. Translation might be possible in some context if it's a language kind of experiential learning. So those kind of things. We also had the question about, let me just see, how can you integrate it through the first year from a programming standpoint? And one of the things to be thinking about for like where it comes into orientation is when we talk about program orientation, there's university orientation, there's often program orientation. I often say to people, talk about what they're going to gain from that experience. We saw those different categories of outcomes. Speak to why those outcomes matter to your students, and then you can link back into those outcomes throughout. It might be indicating an experience here or there that have been, that may be possible. We have one of the speakers on the perceived difference between experiential learning and experiential education. So Lorraine, would you like to maybe chat about experiential learning versus experiential education, or would you like me to?
You can go ahead, Carolyn, that's fine.
Okay, so let's go with the short version and then say you can email us for the long version. One of the things to be thinking about is that there's quite a few different terms that are used out there. So there's work integrated learning, there's experiential learning, there's experiential education, there's reflective practice, there's professional practice, there's technical skill development. So there's a lot of different terms that are used out there. There's also just called plain teaching and plain learning. And so one of the things to be thinking about in these distinctions is that what we've been noticing is that the outcomes shift a little bit, and who is involved in terms of the partner shifts a little bit. So when I think about some experiential education contexts where the focus is on what is the program providing, then you can see that the focus on that experience as partners shifts down to potentially the educators, with the other ones becoming more broader stakeholders. So that's what we're using this framework to understand kind of some of those nuanced differences, but just to understand that they do exist. What you'll be seeing on the screen is ideas coming in, and I hope that you continue to do that. If you're not really interested in writing in the tech in the Google Doc, please just take a moment to write it down on a piece of paper, because we want you to walk away with one option that you can use for sure. All right, so the distinction between work integrated and EL, I briefly touched on it, but one of the key distinctions that we have been looking at is when we figure out which of those things are priority. In work integrated learning, what we were finding is that technical skills and career readiness were the top things, particularly the technical skills and things around awareness of workplace context. Those seem to be what gets talked about in work integrated learning. If we talk about career education, then there's a lot more about career readiness, but from our exploring options and other pieces. And when we talk about experiential learning, there can be some technical, but there's often the conceptual piece, and interpersonal is in there, and then growth is in there. So there's a lot of different combinations of outcomes. Not every description of work integrated learning uses the same set of outcomes as what we've been kind of looking at as well.
Yeah. Can I just add to that, Carolyn, that work integrated learning typically, it usually, almost always, has a component that is integrated with work. So there's an actual component where some kind of experience takes place within the workplace, whereas experiential learning might take place solely within a learning environment that's in the institution, so within the college or within the school or within the university. It doesn't necessarily always involve a placement that's outside in the community or in the workplace, and that's a kind of bit of a key difference between the two as well.
So that design factors that Lorraine presented, that's the first design factor. So that often shifts a lot with work integrated learning, that the main option there is work context. We did have a question about how to keep people engaged and motivated. One of the things to think about when we're in an online environment is that it's a very structured as a very passive listening space unless you build in opportunities to co-create. So the Google Doc in our case is one example of this. The other one to be thinking about is clarity of tasks, because we're often handing off a task, being in separate spaces, and then coming back. I often book in something like a milestone meeting after you've done 10 hours, after you've entered in this. Please set a meeting time. And I get them to set a meeting time with me about where they are in that process. It gives them a bit of independence there. But then what we do is we do at that meeting, they present to me what they've been doing, and then we can continue on the work from there. So they are taking ownership of the work that they're doing. The other one is to recognize that everybody has a lot of life happening. So in the past, you may have been able to devote 80% of your bandwidth to doing this project. If someone's also doing frontline work, perhaps they're working in a grocery store, perhaps they are taking care of family members, perhaps they have somebody who is frontline in health services, they may have 20% of the bandwidth. So having an honest conversation on what's feasible will be important, because we all get a little, if we can't meet our expectations and we're feeling like we're falling behind, that can be very demotivating as well. The other one is to allow for spaces where peers can contribute on peers and in a healthy and good way. Those are ways to help with the motivation.
I noticed that there's a question. Sorry, Carolyn.
Go ahead.
I was going to say there's a question about will there be any plans shared? And yeah, we can speak to that very quickly. That yes, that our framework is going to be published and it will be available, and we can certainly follow up with anybody who's interested and direct them to further resources and the framework as it's available for you.
And you'll see here in this Google Doc, you will have access to this Google Doc. So just the idea of putting in here some of the things that you are trying to like coming up with, look through it, see what other practical suggestions are there. One of the things that is kind of noted is that if you're working with individuals who we typically work really closely with, so that they have relatively low literacy, they're brand new to a context, having a really clear strategy around what that might look like. Maybe in the past, each individual supervisor was going to supervise those students, but maybe it's something an association or a center might stop up and say, all right, we're going to send 200 students out on practicum, and usually their teacher precept does this work, but instead we're going to do a bit of an extra 101 with one teacher precept helping explain and answer some key questions so that everybody can kind of enter in at a little bit higher level, and that might be a little less work on the people who are doing the supervisor. So in terms of just how to bring this down into like the practical kind of conversation, so I see the question of this is great stuff, but very high level. What we want to do is talk about having a very specific conversation. So when I am sitting down to plan the practicum experience that got disrupted halfway through, the first thing I said is check in, how are people doing, where you are, and how are you safe? The next thing I did is I said, of all the possible things that we wanted to learn in this, what are our outcomes? What are the outcomes from the supervisors? What are the outcomes from the students? What we found was that some of the outcomes were just not going to be feasible anymore, but some of the outcomes arose in that moment. So we actually took time to have the conversation of outcomes. That sheet, the reason we have everything on one sheet is take it, make your own, like make your list, adapt it, or use that one, and just bring it to a conversation. Say, circle the ones that matter to you, so that we're making sure we're on the same page. Having a very specific conversation. Know that the people you're working with have very low bandwidth potentially, so you might be coming back to them and saying, these are kind of key outcomes we typically see from placements like yours. Here are some things we might typically do that we could be done in a remote way. Having some suggestions might be happy, like that option sheet that we talked about. But going and knowing what has changed in terms of the design factors, being very specific. So for instance, they were supposed to go and experience something in person. They were supposed to have access to particular equipment. None of that was going to happen. What is our alternative to that? So having very specific conversations there. All right. Lorraine, is there a question that grabbed your attention?
There's another question. There's a question been asked, is this being created for high school or college students? And that's an excellent question. And that's one that's very much on our minds because we set out with this work looking at the university environment, and I can answer, speaking from myself, and I'm probably going to drop Carolyn in it now for future work, but say absolutely. Yes, we do. We always envisaged that this framework could be a dynamic framework that would be able to be workable for different contexts, different institutions, different contexts. So yes, we have a plan to look at how this might be able to be supportive for work that's done with experiential learning within the high school environment and possibly even the elementary school environment too, as more and more of our provinces across Canada are looking to embed experiential learning within areas of the curriculum. So that's something on our to-do list, and yeah, keep a lookout for that because we will be moving forward with work that looks at those contexts as well.
And Lorraine has a background in experience. She's a bit modest, but she has a background in experience looking at career education within the high school context. So we were considering, and occasionally did a check and said, what's different here, what's not? And what we found was the stakeholders shifted a little bit, particularly like which government body and things like alumni relations look different. But what we were finding is that and then emphasis looks different, but we are finding that there's some ability to adapt this framework, but we actually also really respect that high school is a different context than college. And particularly when you're talking about things like consent and parental consent and what students are able to go and do, it looks a bit different. So we have had some interest ideas for the Google Docs, so that's been kind of continued to be posted. One of the things to do is when staff right now are really busy, providing them the specific tools. So for instance, having a conversation that says, how are you going to be meeting with the students? And if they're not sure and they've never used technology to meet with the students, then maybe having a conversation that says, you know, a phone call is probably fine. You know, if they're at that point where they just don't want another technology option, a phone call might be fine. There may be conversations around as an institution about, can you support particular types of working meetings? Maybe it is a session with a mentor or something. How can you structure and provide some of those? The other one I'm going to suggest in here is thinking really through how to build relationships. So one of the first things that we can lose when we go online is it can become very distant, cerebral, but it also can become very much, I'm dropping in, saying hi, and all you know about me is what I've talked about. So how do we give them prompts? How do we ask them potentially to write a bit of a, like, what do you know, who am I as a person? And to ask the students to do that in ways that are professionally done. So what does that look like to tell you who I am in a person as a professional? Maybe that's a workshop we offer students. Maybe that's part of the practicum is they write an introduction blurb because they won't be taken around the office to shake everybody's hand and meet everybody at lunchtime. So how do they say this is a quick blurb about who I am? How do they start to get the skills to introduce themselves at the beginning of a session with just one piece of information about them? And thinking about how they build relationships in those ways. So Lorraine, any question catch your eye, and then I'll take one final one as well.
Well, I think given our time, we need to move on to the constructive alignment, and then maybe just have one last minute or so for any further questions that come in while I'm talking through this slide. So please keep giving us your questions as I talk to you about constructive alignment. And this is how we're going to conclude this webinar, because it's a reminder of the importance of alignment when we're thinking about our outcomes, our activities, and our assessments. We know that not all teaching activities create the same learning, and that not all assessment furthers and measures the same learning. And this is where alignment is really important. So this is a kind of key message to leave you with, if you like. We also know that the pandemic has created an environment where students are deeply anxious and stressed about the future, as are many of our stakeholders that we're working with. So subsequently ensuring that our intended outcomes, doing that touch-in that Carolyn talked about, just sitting people around the table and saying, okay, what can we salvage from this? what's still feasible, what's manageable, but what are the key outcomes we want to achieve? And having that in that conversation in a supportive context with your students is crucial. And then we can hopefully work to a place where our outcomes are able to still be met through our aligned activities and assessment strategies that we decide to pursue in our new remote environment. Because we feel that providing this foundation is crucial and will help you to ensure your students are still able to have a positive learning experience through their experiential learning and work integrated learning. I know that we've reached the end of our time now. We would encourage you, we've popped up the question slide there, and it's got our emails. So if we haven't addressed your questions within this webinar, if you still have questions for us, please take advantage of reaching out to us via email. We're more than happy to continue this conversation with you and try to support you all as you operate within this remote environment and deal with your own stress levels, and in turn support your students to continue with experiential learning and or work integrated learning.
Thank you to both of you for your presentation today. Yeah, it was terrific to see all this great engagement with a lot of great questions. So thank you all for your great engagement. Lorraine and Carolyn, thank you both of you for this great and interactive presentation today. It was really interesting to learn more about your approach to experiential learning and to discuss what options remain available for the students we're working with during these unprecedented times. So thank you for having shared your knowledge and expertise with us today.
Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to talk to you all, and thank you all very much for our registrants for coming in and spending the time with us. And just to repeat, we're more than happy to continue the conversation and try to support you in your practices in whatever way we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, we do encourage you to reach out directly to Lorraine and Carolyn to get the conversation coming and continuing. And before leaving, you may want to continue your learning journey. So let me share one webinar that's happening tomorrow, Friday, actually, this Friday, May 15, with Michelle Dittmer, called Gap Years as an Answer to Educational Disruption, Tools and Ideas for Professionals and Parents. Also, you can still get access to the recording of our very popular webinars on the career theories that we recently did with John Wooden from Australia and David Blusting from US. So please visit our website at ceric.ca/webinars for more information or to register. And don't forget to subscribe to our webinar news to stay informed of new webinars opportunities. Now, please don't forget to share your feedback and future learning needs with us in the survey that will just pop up on your screen. And let me now close by thanking you once again, Lorraine and Carolyn, for your presentation today. And thank you all for your wonderful engagements. Have a great day and see you at another learning opportunity.
Take care and keep safe, everyone.
Take care. All the best.